Welcome to Assisted. I'm Chelsea Roff. Assisted dying is said to be a compassionate, caring choice.
But in this series, we explore why it's not that simple. I'm Fiona Mackenzie, and we'll look at why assisted dying has such a big impact on women. Chelsea and I are incredibly pleased to have the company of Jane Monckton Smith this week. She is a Professor of Public Protection at the University of Gloucestershire, but also the author of an incredible book called In Control, which completely upended my thinking on domestic homicides. You know, the myth that domestic homicides are just someone losing control, that he was provoked or goaded into killing her. She put forward a much clearer, much better evidenced argument that actually it was increasing control over a long relationship that leads to a homicide. So pleased to have you here today, Jane, and really, I almost wish we weren't talking about assisted dying because I know you've got so much other work to share. You've made a couple of public statements on Twitter around the bill. What drew you into the debate on this?
Well, the first thing that drew me into it was that I wasn't seeing anybody talking about coercive control and domestic abuse. And I couldn't really understand why I wasn't seeing that. So I thought, well, I need to wade in here, especially as I'm so caught up in the world of suicide at the moment. And this assisted dying could be thought of as suicide. So it was really important to me. I'm not actually opposed to the idea that some people are suffering so badly that they may want that suffering to end. I really do get that. I understand that. But anything that it is going to apply to everyone, really, and not simply the awful case studies that we see all the time that would make you think, yes, this bill is really important. There are so many others that appear to be just being ignored. And I'm worried, really, really worried, that people are going to lose their lives through the actions of somebody else and not their own desire to end their life.
Yeah, I think a concern that really share with it. I just wanted to kick us off. You mentioned coercive control there, and that's something that's actually defined in UK law. I mean, basically no one knows what coercive control is. I mean, could you just set out what coercive control looks like?
Yeah, coercive control is complex. I think we all recognise that. So I'm just going to give a very, very short, quick, soundbite version of what coercive control is. Two things I think we need to understand. First, that coercive control is a framework for understanding domestic abuse. It's not a tactic of domestic abuse. It's the whole framework. If you understand coercive control, you understand what's going on in domestic. And I think the easiest definition is that coercive control is a pattern of behaviour designed to trap someone in a relationship. Now, that obviously doesn't capture all of the complexities, but what it does capture is the mindset of controlling people and why they act as they do. And if we understand that it's about trapping somebody in a relationship, we can see most of the reasons that coercive control escalates to suicide and homicide.
There's been very little, as you mentioned, talk of coercive control. I can imagine someone saying, well, if we're trying to trap someone in a relationship, surely they wouldn't want to then kill or end the person's life. So how is coercive control relevant to assisted death?
Well, if you trapped someone in a relationship, you're kind of saying you possess them. You kind of own them. You have an entitlement to that person to control the things they do to your benefit. There are, people who try to leave relationships, escape the entrapment, for example, and that can escalate to homicide. But what if that person is no longer of benefit to you inside that relationship? Quite a lot of the time, you're dog in the manger about it. You don't want anybody else to have them, but you don't want them either. You don't want to be left being responsible for caring for someone. You perhaps want your freedom to go off and find somebody else to entrap in a relationship. And when we consider that suicides as a result of coercive control far outweigh homicides, and that's, where victims are feeling that entrapment and are traumatized by that entrapment, can't escape, can't leave the relationship. If they do leave the relationship, they're going to suffer even more. People are taking their own lives in really high numbers as a result of that. So yeah, it's about entrapping someone, but why would you want to entrap someone? Because it's of some benefit to you. When they stop being a benefit, you don't want to trap them anymore.
And I know suicide after domestic abuse is, it's a new focus for government. I know that that's something that it's investigated in what used to be called domestic homicide reviews. So, it's now beginning to be recognised that, as you say, people will be abused by their partner and will either be coerced directly into suicide or will commit suicide as a result of the trauma of that abuse. I suppose what's challenging for all of us is to think, well, now we have this lawful form of suicide that would be available, and how does that look when you have an abuser and a partner who might have a terminal diagnosis?
I think there's quite a conflict going on here. You're talking about lawful, almost this lawful environment where someone can help you take your own life, just at the point where the criminal justice system is recognising the criminal culpability in suicide. So criminal culpability is being recognised in two key ways at the moment. One, that somebody could potentially cause you to take your own life. Now, there has been a conviction for that. There was a case recently where there was not a conviction. There is another case that has already been to court and is going to be heard where, a man has caused his partner to take her own life. There are 2 or 3 more waiting in the wings. So we are moving forward in recognising how a controlling person can cause you to take your own life. The second place where we're recognising criminal culpability is in what's called a staged homicide, a homicide that is staged as a suicide. Now, the research in this area is shocking, and the research, and this is international research, is saying that a domestic abuse related homicide is the most common homicide to be staged. And the most common way it will be staged is as a suicide. So we already have a significant problem where suicides have been staged. What if we bring in legislation to make that even easier? So we've got these 2 developing areas of criminal culpability, and we're bringing in legislation that says we're going to make this easier when we've just recognised what a huge problem this already is, and we're going to make it worse. That is what really concerns me.
Concern is so right. When I looked at things like failed suicide pacts, which seem to be quite staged, and in that type of case, men get off, if they get convicted, they get off with a suspended sentence. But that is in a system where you have a coroner and you have police investigation and you have court and you have news reporting, and it's a very public and exposing system, and these men are still able to exploit it. And you're potentially going to have this completely private system which no one can interrogate. And also, I think you may have seen, but the bill as proposed adjusts the coroner's duty. So in these cases, that removes the coroner's duty to investigate a suicide. And there is no mechanism for family to get involved, to stop it, to refer it to a panel, to intervene, to get a domestic homicide review. There's just nothing. And so that, I think, is just really strange, given we know Labour are supposed to be quite good on violence against women and girls, that we're doing something that is almost completely opening this door in another direction.
And opening it at a time when we just recognised the huge problem that suicide and coercive control is. It's antithetical, isn't it? It feels like, now that we've recognised that women especially, not always, but women especially, are being pushed to take their own lives. And we're just saying, hang on a minute, you mustn't push someone to take their own life. We're going to start prosecuting people for this. And then at the same time, we're saying, and there's this thing, we're actually going to make it easier for you as well to push someone to take their own life and claim that they wanted to do it all along. I don't understand it.
I wonder if some MPs will think that domestic abuse is totally irrelevant to this, because they're very focused, particularly the bills. I think the pro-bill MPs are very focused on, they know who this is for. Like, they know it's for people who really need choice at the end of life, who are in suffering, It's not about coercion. It's not about people in domestically abusive situations. But I guess the problem is that this bill has to work in real life, and something like 15 or 16% of over 60s are suffering domestic abuse in the UK. That's an awful lot of people who might potentially be getting a terminal diagnosis and seeking assisted dying. What would you say to an MP who doesn't think it's that plausible that an abuser would seek this route?
Because this route of let's make it look like a suicide is already being significantly used. So why would that suddenly stop? Why would that suddenly stop? I would want that MP to have a look at the number of fatalities directly attributable to domestic abuse that there are, and how many of those are where people have either chosen to take their own lives, or it has been made to look as if they had taken their own lives. We have only just started very, very recently counting domestic abuse suicides. Now, the first count, and it's very, very early, has suggested 3 women a week are taking their own lives as a result of domestic abuse. That's one thing that any MP should know. However, the other research is saying that it's anything between 3 and potentially 9 a week. Now, that's a massive number. So to say that domestic abuse is irrelevant in this debate means that you haven't been listening.
One of the debates we've seen happen on the committees so far is around the question of whether the bill as written is sufficient to ensure that a person who's being coerced is not handed a lethal medication to end their life. There's no explicit mention of coercive control, but there is of coercion. I wondered if we could get your thoughts on that, and in your experience, how likely is it that a GP or a psychiatrist who maybe doesn't know the person very well is likely to pick up on this dynamic in their relationship?
I think there are individual professionals out there who definitely would probably be all over it. They may have, educated themselves. They may have suffered abuse themselves. They may know somebody that has. So there are definitely individual professionals out there probably who would be good at spotting these things. But the majority, no. You're constantly hearing about the police need more training. These people need more training. Domestic homicide reviews, which now include domestic abuse related suicides, they are constantly saying, we need to train people. We are not giving forensic skills to our medical professionals in the context of domestic abuse. We're not really giving anybody forensic skills in domestic abuse. We're giving them more social skills. So first of all, I would say, if you're going to train people, for example, what does that training include? Because we are talking about an area where we could be looking at a potential homicide, in fact, or a criminal culpability because you're pushing someone to suicide. That is going to take forensic domestic abuse skills. And I do not believe that is what will happen. And I do not believe that there are nearly enough people who understand forensically what domestic abuse is.
Just for listeners, forensically in this case would be almost investigative, with the sort of almost like a police investigator rather than...
Looking at it more from a legal perspective, a criminal perspective, and that is what we have to, because if you coerce someone to take their own life, that's an offence, right? That's an offence, unless it fits with this bill.
That's the fear, isn't it? And just to sort of Chelsea's thought there, that we've spoken to people in Canada on this, and we've heard from witnesses in Australia who provide assisted death, and often the assessment will be an hour or maybe 90 minutes, often over the phone with someone they haven't met before.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems almost designed not to catch anything.
And I would add they also have asserted to the committee that coercion just does not happen. So there's no evidence of coercion. It doesn't happen. But at the same time, they don't collect the evidence, and they don't do the investigations. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. How likely do you think it is that coercion does not happen in any of the jurisdictions that have legalized assisted?
Oh my God. I mean, the first answer has to be, if you don't identify it right, it hasn't happened as far as you're concerned. But that doesn't mean it hasn't happened, does it? And I think our suicide statistics and what we know about suicide and domestic abuse and what we know about homicide and domestic abuse, and it does have a direct correlation to this, we absolutely know that that is an international kind of catastrophe. All governments are saying violence against women and girls, and that includes domestic abuse and domestic homicides. You can't say they're not happening. And the homicides that you might think of, that you were talking about, Fiona, in the beginning, where it's very clear that this is a homicide, they're dwarfed by the suicides and the alleged suicides. So yes, they are happening. They are happening. And I was reading research as well from palliative care, end-of-life specialists talking about domestic abuse. Domestic abuse escalates with a diagnosis of an end-of-life condition. Why do these people think that coercion does not happen in this particular context? I think you'd have to have a very utopian mindset to think that could possibly be the case. Macmillan Cancer were specifically talking about terminal cancer diagnoses. So the first thing that I found really shocking was that domestic abuse victims are getting their diagnoses later. So they are generally having palliative care rather than curative care. Now that's something we need to think about as well, that they may be blocked or deterred from looking after their own health. And then you fall straight into maybe end-of-life care. And that's when this research is saying domestic abuse escalates at that point, because this victim has gone from somebody who follows all the rules and maybe looks after the home. I'm talking from a very traditional perspective, but a lot of these domestic abusers do think in a very traditional way. And all of a sudden they become somebody who maybe their priorities change. Why wouldn't they? Their priorities might change. Medical professionals will come in and claw some of the control away from that controlling person, because they will start making decisions. That person may need care as well, and that partner may be required or expected to give some care. They're also, they're losing entire control, and that's when they tend to escalate anyway. So it's not a surprise that abuse escalates with an end-of-life condition.
I can just see that in that moment how attractive an assisted death would be to an abuser in that circumstance.
I have been involved in cases, and this is only anecdotal, of course it is, but I work at an awful lot of cases. And there have been a number of cases I've worked on where medication has been withdrawn from victims who are actually asking for it, begging for it in some cases. So to think that this is not one of the most important aspects of concern in this assisted dying bill is almost criminal.
It's really worrying, and I've mentioned this before, but the scale of this is enormous. If we end up like Australia, we might have 9,500 deaths a year within a couple of years of operation. Of those, 1,000 will be domestic abuse victims, just the way the stats work. And if you're saying that actually domestic abuse victims are more likely to get a terminal diagnosis because they're being controlled away from seeking healthcare, and maybe they're going to seek suicide or be coerced into suicide, it might even be more. And that's potentially many times the number that we have already being killed in homicides or suicides after domestic abuse. So I think MPs need to take it really seriously. Jane, you mentioned that you've got involved because you just didn't see what you should see, which is people really, really wrestling with this problem. What would you like to see more of from MPs as they're considering how to deal with the issues of coercive control and potentially homicidal abusive partners being able to access assisted death?
I think one of the first things is to raise the status of domestic abuse in this debate. We are getting people talking about, it's not that important, it's not happening. If it is happening, we know it when we see it. That is not taking this problem seriously at all, which is not unusual for domestic abuse. And yet again, here we see it again. I think that unless we do take this incredibly seriously, this bill is going to be the worst thing potentially that we've ever done to domestic abuse victims. That, it's just my opinion. But I also agree that some people might want to take their own lives through suffering. We've got to have the safeguards, and coercive control and domestic abuse is one of the huge areas that safeguards are needed.
We just can't look internationally. I think that's the issue, is that where this has been done previously in other countries around the world, they just don't really think about domestic abuse at all. And they do a little in Australia, as we've mentioned here before, but they never screen anyone out. So although they train doctors with a bit of online e-learning, they never actually screen anyone out, apart from I think maybe one or two people in New South Wales.
Isn't it a shame that in England and Wales, we were absolute trailblazers by recognising coercive control and getting that legislation out there and rolling out all this training and saying we really understand it. And then we look to other countries who were not trailblazers and say that they know what they are better at coercive control than those countries that have introduced this legislation and have recognised it. It feels like, as I've already said, we've got this legislation. We know that people need to be highly trained. We know now that we have got to start thinking about criminalising people who coerce someone to take their own life. We know that suicides are being, faked. And then this one bill comes along where we say, oh, actually, none of that matters. It doesn't make sense.
I want to ask you about an amendment that's been put forward that I think is seeking to address exactly this concern that you've raised around coercive control. It was put forward by an MP named Jess Asado, and it would require training in respect to domestic abuse, including, and it explicitly says, coercive control and financial abuse. And it would make it mandatory for the doctors and the medical professionals that are doing these assessments. It actually, I think the positive is that it has, by my read, it's got more names supporting this amendment than almost any other amendment that's been put forward. Do you think it will be sufficient?
I'm a little bit skeptical. I think it's a great amendment. I think, it is starting to bring coercion and control and domestic abuse to the centre of the debate. If anything, I would just say, does it go far enough? It's absolutely crucial we have an amendment like this. Does it go far enough? We chuck around the word training all the time. Who's going to deliver that? What type of training is it going to be? Are they going to oversee what's in that training? Or are we going to tick a box and say, well, they've had domestic abuse training? Coercion and control is a very specific area of domestic abuse, and coercive control is a framework, remember, for understanding domestic abuse. It could be great if it's got a forensic leaning. So I think the amendment, absolutely yes, but let's make it as strong as possible and followed up. We know that forensic training is the best for identifying domestic abuse by medical professionals.
I totally agree with you. But I just think we have to be so worried about the chocolate safeguards that sound nice, make everyone feel like everything's going to be okay, but actually they sort of melt under the slightest pressure. And having seen the stats on training around the world, it doesn't work to detect domestic abuse. That's not to say we couldn't devise much better training, and I know Jess is great on domestic abuse, and Kim Ledbetter, the bill sponsor, wants gold standard training for the doctors involved. But I think there's a real risk that the numbers in this are so big that if you miss even half the people, you're talking about many, many times more than are killed in domestic homicides or suicides. It's just, the scale is so huge.
The fact that it's not in there already astounds me. The fact that there's no explicit mention of coercive control in the bill, and it'll be interesting to see how things play out in the committee, because thus far none of the amendments that have been put forward to try to strengthen assessment of coercion have been accepted. They've all been rejected. So I think it's a really good step in the right direction. And as you say, it may be very complicated to actually get those trainings right, and they may be insufficient. I wonder, what would you add to the bill to try to strengthen this? Can you think of anything that's glaringly missing that might, in tandem with that, help to prevent this from harming women?
You know what? I would a lot of people will probably disagree with this, but I would make you have to prove you're not coercive and controlling before you even get into the first stages of this. If you're going to, as a partner, if you're going to be involved in this person's decision, I'd be vetting them first. And I know that probably would be a very, very unpopular opinion on what we should do. But, you shouldn't be able to get past the bar of you're coercively controlling. You are not allowed to be involved in this whatsoever. You may not assist this person. If anyone's going to assist this person, it's somebody who is not controlling, who does not have a history of coercive control. And they wouldn't be allowed to be involved.
Max Hill said that he thought this was a good bill because he'd looked at cases that came across his desk in the CPS, and that this was good because we were now doing the investigation before the person died. But we're obviously not doing a full police investigation, domestic homicide review, court case, press reporting. We're doing a little phone call for an hour, possibly, and a panel who may or may not see the person, so probably won't see the person.
What are they going to be looking at, Fiona? What information are they going to be looking at to try and identify control? Do they know? Or coercion?
And this is the terrible thing. No, and because they will probably, I think in Australia there's voluminous forms that you need to fill in to say it's all been done properly. You can see that it just becomes a form filling. There's something a bit unusual on the form.
So your training will then be spotting certain things on the form that may or may not indicate what. You could not tell from a form unless there's a box saying, are you being controlled? And somebody says yes. I mean, because that's how's that going to work?
We do that in maternity healthcare, actually. That the midwives will ask you, is everything okay at home? Are you ever frightened? That's it. And that obviously doesn't pick up everyone who's in a domestically abusive relationship, but it picks up some women.
Are they going? I mean, do they speak to? No, well, of course they're not going to. If it's a desk exercise, and it sounds like it's going to be a desk exercise, who's even filled that form in? Do they know?
The other piece I would bring up is that your idea that a person who's involved in supporting the person would need to prove that they're not they don't have a history of domestic abuse and coercive control. There is a clause in the bill that allows for a proxy to sign the forms, and that proxy can be, and I quote, I'm not quoting off memory, but something along the lines of a member of good standing in the community is how it's worded, and that's about all you get.
It could be anyone.
I suppose it depends on whether you care. Whether you care. Why? What is the reason for rushing the bills through? What is the reason for I think the paper exercise is probably resource argument, isn't it? We can't actually afford to vet all of these, can we? Why is anybody admitting that? And how many of us, a lot of people might know somebody who they think, yeah, that person really wanted to die, or if I ever became that ill and suffering that much, I'd want to die. But do you ever see yourself as a victim of control or abuse? No, you probably don't. And, as you get older, the potential for abuse can rise. I think it's maybe sitting there only looking through one, quite a myopic view of what this problem is. People who want to die, who would say they want to die if they didn't want to? Maybe a lot of people who actually take their own lives as a result of domestic abuse. They just want to escape the abuse, that's all.
Wow. We're really walking into a nightmare.
I think so.
Hi, it's Fiona. Chelsea and I were so keen that we start to hear some really detailed debate on what assisted dying could look like here in the UK for women. We do not have big money funding, so if you'd like to support us, you can go over to our Substack and subscribe there, or you can donate to The Other Half on our website, theotherhalf.uk/donate. So grateful for this and so grateful for you listening, though. Thank you.